former student Vitalina. Hello, hi Vitalina, how are you? Good to see you. I also teach at the University of Texas in the urban planning program there. Who our other colleague Tanya Samilov is also a graduate of that program. So I'm connected in some way to both of those sections. And so we're going to have a series of three talks related to movement in this next section. Um, I'll be giving the first talk, and basically, this topic is three areas that intersect some way. The first is some basic concepts on freight transportation. The second is on parking regulation and transportation safety. And the third is on accommodating invisible disabilities into transportation. Um, and Again, these are topics that I pulled from some of the earlier lectures I've delivered, both at Key School of Economics and then also at other venues. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Topics mobility. And let me move my screen up just a second. Here we still have more people joining.
Yeah,
All right. Can everyone see the screen?
yeah.
Okay.
But we also see next slide mode. So
Then
we
the
don't see
next
full.
slide mode. Okay, let me go to display setting. Maybe
Yeah,
this one.
that's it. That's it.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about these various topics in transportation. So I'm gonna spend some time talking about topics that don't get as much press or as much coverage in the transportation discussion because most of the time topics that are discussed in transportation are those that are closest to the individual. So cars and train and buses and light rail. But I'm going to talk about some aspects of transportation that are more hidden in our daily lives. And the first, which this will be similar to what Vitalina has heard before. Apologies, Vitalina, for this. The first is the freight transportation. Uh, One challenge when we talk about transportation planning is incorporating in freight transportation, which can have substantial safety impacts and environmental impacts with passenger transport. Um, Typically, freight transportation is planned by the private sector, and it's often not well publicized what those private operators are doing. And sometimes there can be a disconnect between the freight transportation services and the passenger transportation services. One area of freight transportation that we expect to grow very rapidly as Ukraine recovers from war is in the area of intermodal transportation. And this is another term for containerized transportation. So, containerized transportation, like the little boxes that you see on this very large ship on the left, is the primary means by which consumer goods are moved from place to place. So, um, consumer goods have to be protected from the elements. And for this reason, they are typically moved in these standard boxes called containers that are all of identical dimensions wherever you are in the world. And you probably have seen a container like this moving on the road, being carried by a truck. But the reason why we use the term intermodal is that containers can move the same way between modes. They can move from a ship to a train to a truck to any other type of mode, and they can do that without ever having to open the physical box. And for this reason, the T-shirt that was packaged in China when it is arrives at the distribution center in Kiev will have never been opened at any point in transit. And so that's good for efficiency, and it's also good for cargo security for goods that are higher value. So we think that containers will be playing a much greater role in Ukraine's future mobility because we predict that Ukraine's economy will grow quite rapidly after the war, and also that Ukraine will not only send containers uh, to other countries and receive them from other countries, but also a lot of other countries will send containers through Ukraine to reach uh, Central Europe. So here we see example of a ship carrying containers. This would be a very large ship, probably larger than any that you would see in the port of Odessa. And this is an example of a technology that might be possible in Ukraine as well, which is called a double stack container train, where containers are stacked two on two, and that allows for more cargo to be handled within uh, for a long over a long distance. Looking further, other ways in which containers are handled. You have uh, what we call drayage. Drayage trucks are trucks that take containers from a port, or let's say from a rail terminal, and take them to a distribution center. So they tend to go back and forth on the same route all day. And for this reason, they tend to operate primarily in urban environments. So when we encounter trucks that are handling containers, they can have a lot of impacts on road safety. They can also have a lot of impacts on road emissions because since these trucks don't typically drive very long distances in a day, they tend to use quite old trucks to do this job. Those old trucks are much more polluting. And so those trucks that run in cities handling containers tend to produce a significant share of the overall pollution within the supply chain. One more option that I'm sure Lilette is more familiar with is what we call container on barge. So container on barge is a way to move containers from the port facility to other cities along river systems. And this is done um, a lot in northwestern Europe, particularly from the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, um, because the port of Rotterdam is the load center for much of Europe. And so it moves containers by river, and that allows for far less congestion on the road, far greater safety, um, and also far lower emissions. So this would be one option to examine for Ukraine going forward is how to use the Dnipro River for moving containers on the river. And of course, that would take probably certain modifications to to the river infrastructure, but it might be worthwhile, particularly given the fact that so much cargo will need to be moved for reconstruction. And if you look in the past, when Ukraine rebuilt after the Second World War, the Dnipro River was used for a substantial percentage of those goods. So we hope to see massive changes in Ukraine's port modal system to make it ready for this change. This would include expansion of port infrastructure at existing container ports, the addition of new container terminals in terminals that currently only handle Ukraine's traditional export commodities like coal and grain, and other smaller terminals like river terminals that could help reduce the burden. So this is not only container handling on the Dnipro River, but also the river systems bordering Romania, such as the ones that uh, played such a critical role in the early days of the war uh, when the port of Odessa was blockaded. So those are a few concepts on container handling. And of course, a container, as I mentioned, it's a standard unit of measurement. It's measured in feet rather than in meters because they started in the United States. So every container in the world, even if it's in Europe or in China, is measured in feet. So they're either 20 feet or 40 feet long, and these are used for handling massive amounts of cargo at the same time. But then the other trend that we're seeing in freight transportation is not only the growth of massive ships like this one that can carry thousands of containers at one time, we're also seeing the growth of micro scale freight delivery. Just a second, I have a message in the chat. Just one second. Okay. We also see a lot of smaller scale freight delivery that uses both app-based systems uh, uh, to reduce the footprint of freight. And so, in a lot of European cities, wherever possible, they're replacing the traditional trucks that deliver cargo with either bicycles or small four-wheel vehicles that have far less of a footprint on on the street network, and that prevents a lot of the freight problems with blocking of streets and roads and parking. Even more futuristic is the use of either AI powered or human directed robots um, that deliver parcels in downtown areas. So this would be for small parcels that need to be delivered over a relatively short distance. So these would be these rolling drones that you see here, like the one marked FedEx. In some cases, the you have an operator, kind of like the FPV operators that you see in Ukraine for military purposes, driving one of these little cars, or they can be powered by AI, and they can direct themselves to where they need to go. So we see a lot of new technologies coming in the freight field right now. In some ways, the freight transportation is changing more rapidly than passenger transportation because you can have a lot of experiments with cargo delivery that there is when there's a profit incentive to do so. So it might be a challenge in Ukraine to deploy um, uh, drone delivery of parcels, meaning flying drone delivery of parcels, because of the ongoing military situation and also because of the fact that a lot of people in Ukraine associate the sound of a drone with danger. So there would probably be a lot of resistance to having flying drones delivering packages to to places in urban environments. But um, uh, but vehicles like the one on the right that are ground based probably could have a much greater role to play in urban freight delivery. Um, so that's the main thing that I wanted to talk about with respect to freight. Before I go on to the next topic, let me pause for a minute to, for any questions or comments from the audience. Is there anything that you didn't understand that you'd like me to clarify? Okay. Hearing none, let me. We have. Oh, Dennis. Oh, Dennis just has the thumbs up. Okay, so I will take that as permission to go forward. So the next topic that I'd like to talk about is another topic that we might call the black sheep of um, of transportation, or the black swan, I guess you could say, uh, which is parking. So obviously, parking is a tremendous problem in cities. Uh, Parking, is something that we don't think about a lot, but parking and how it's provided, how much of it is provided, all of these topics um, can determine whether or not a city thrives or stalls. So there was a very famous author named Donald Shoup who devoted his entire career to the study of parking policies both in the United States and Europe, and why parking does so much damage to cities. Um, and basically, Shoup's idea was that because of the fact that parking was considered boring and not very interesting, nobody studied it. And because nobody studied it, no progress was made in making it better. And one of Shoup's main ideas was that there were four factors in US cities that were adopted to the most extent in the United States, but have also harm for having too much parking within the city, having too much land devoted to parking. The first was that in the United States, you tend to have zones of exclusive use. You tend to have zoning of land, and that zoning breaks the land down into different components, like one area of the city where you would only have homes, one area of the city where you might only have commercial activity, and another area of the city that you might only have manufacturing. That means that every time you are moving from one function to another, you have to leave one part of the city and drive to another part of the city because you can't typically walk that significant distance. So that tends to add more parking. The other component is that you had fixed density limits. So you would have a maximum density within any one area of the city, and that means that you need some form of mechanized travel, um, and that can impede the viability of transit because you don't have a large enough cluster of people living around a transit stop to use it effectively. The third factor that subsidized, and it was subsidized sometimes through less obvious ways. So sometimes when you built a building, you had to provide a certain number of parking spots per 1,000 square meters of interior space. And so that mandatory parking minimum uh, served to um, uh, there were a lot more parking spaces than would otherwise be provided by the free market. So there's a reason why they chose to have mandatory parking minimums because if you have a situation in which everybody, uh, like is the case, um, uh, where everybody has a car, then you either have them parking in their own space, in their own building, or they're going to be parking either on the street or in the case of Ukraine, they might be parking somewhere on public land, like in a what was supposed to be a public use space. And so there's a reason for internalizing that. But by demanding a minimum number of parking spaces per home, you basically subsidize the parking provision. And once people are already paying for the parking spot, then they might as well buy a car because they already have a parking spot. So it's like you have a hammer that you need to nail. Um, so that was the original justification for parking minimums. And then I have a question or a comment here um, in the chat from Yulia. It says, "What legal ways could be used to reduce personal cars? It could help tackle the issue." Well, let me first ask you, Yulia, what are your ideas on this?
It's a real problem. First of all, hi, Nathan, and thank you for your commitment, for your lecture. And, it's a real problem for us,
Mhm.
especially with for our city. I'm from Cherkasy. It's a middle-sized city in the central part of Ukraine. And we are not a very large city, and we had a population of approximately 280,000 people. And then after the beginning of the war, we are the city where many replaced people are living now. And so we are observing now that really the amount of personal cars not doubled, but I think it was increased in several times. So our streets and our prospects, boulevards are not suitable for such amount of personal cars. And as a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, and I I was thinking about this problem. So if a person possesses something, yes, some item and car, I didn't find any legal way to forbid it. So it's not in the legal yes sphere. But I was thinking about Barcelona, for example. Yes, so it's a huge city, but there is a perfect system of public transport there. So it's not convenient to use a personal car, though.
Mm.
So it's really convenient and it's super using. It's very fast and very cozy, very convenient transport, public transport. I mean, so we don't have such nice and suitable system of public transport. So I'm confused. I don't know, but it's a real problem for us now.
Yeah, it's I would say it's hardest to solve these problems in medium-sized cities. Because if you have a small city, you typically have one major street and you have an obvious route for the streetcar or the bus. If you have a very large city, well, you have enough density everywhere. But it's really in cities that are 200, 300, 400,000 people where you have the most difficult challenge of having a good alternative to driving. And we have seen during the war, in some ways, this has gotten worse because, of course, people are concerned about what if I have to leave urgently. So a lot of people who weren't driving before have started getting their license. I remember my students were saying, a lot of my female students were saying that they for the first time learned to drive uh, as a result of the war. Um, so you have a lot more people driving, and you also have a lot of interference in terms of public transit due to electricity problems. And so that also, when transit is less reliable, that has also made it more problematic. I think that for smaller cities, anything that you can do to magnify the density artificially, so one thing that you can do is the provision of park and ride systems. So you have a designated place for someone to if they still have a car, to park their car and take the transit into the city so that you're removing parking from the center of the city and making it more pedestrian friendly. Um, of course, the general policy, like Lillette is mentioning, an economic tool raising the marginal cost of gasoline is very viable. Of course, as electric cars become more popular and more affordable to more people, that becomes only a partial solution because if everybody switches to an electric car, well, yes, you then could make the electricity more expensive, but uh, gasoline, where you only really buy the gasoline if you're going to put it into the car, if you make everybody's electricity very, very expensive, well, that's going to harm people's overall electricity consumption. So it's hard to use it in a punitive way to disincentivize driving. So it's really the question of what you're really trying to achieve. Is your goal to get everyone into a multi-person vehicle, or would you also consider it to be transit if you are using more shared cars, like the Uber or anything else, but you have fewer total cars in the system? So if you can say one strategy, for example, in the United States, where in most cases it's not realistic for people to not have any car, but if you say that we can have one car per family as opposed to two cars, that can be seen as a victory. So any tool that you can use that allows people to have a backup option for the 10% of the time that they need the second car, whether that's Uber, or whether that's a bike share, or any other tool, that can be seen as a way of reducing the overall number of cars in the system. So that's another question because usually when people buy a car, when they cross that threshold, they end up using that car a whole lot. And the reason for this is that car ownership is has very high fixed costs and relatively low marginal costs. And what that means from an economic perspective is once you buy the car rapidly depreciates. It goes down in value very rapidly. So if you buy the car and you just have it parked on the street, it's not economical for you. You're losing money every day just having the car sit. So when you buy the car, you end up using the car a lot because you want to extract as much value from it as you can. Now, raising the cost of the gasoline raises the marginal cost as well, but you still have the fact that it's depreciating. And as of course Ukraine becomes a wealthier country, and the cars that people are buying are not the old Soviet style cars, but they're more expensive Western cars, that's even more true. So you want people when they buy a car to not buy a like a really bad car. You want them to buy a good, safe car, and to maybe use that car enough. But then you also don't want them to feel that they have to, for example, buy a second car because they have 10% or 15% of the time they need to do it and to use it. And then Vitalina was mentioning here, so a tax for an extra car. So maybe like you use an economic incentive and you treat it like it would be almost like you have a tax deduction for your property taxes, but to a certain threshold. And then if you go above that, then you get more tax. So this would be the same sort of idea for a car, right? Maybe the first car, you have a relatively low tax rate. Maybe you have a higher tax rate for the second car. Vitalina or sorry, that was not Vitalina, that was Vesna. Gocheva, who was mentioning that. Is that what you were referring to? Or then the and then the comment by Vitalina was, would underground parking be a compromise solution? So underground parking definitely partially solves the problem because in my class we always talk about the internalization of externalities. So we talk about making it more expensive for the user, and underground parking is very expensive to provide. And so if you have a provision that more of the parking has to be underground, if you're charging the actual users of that underground parking, that also raises the cost of owning a car and disincentivizes the owning of a car. And so Yeah, and so let's see, someone else comments, in the case of Kiev, I sometimes think that it would be easier to demolish everything and build from scratch or just demolish the politicians. Okay, so a radical idea here. And then yeah, or are you thinking about converting some of the shelters maybe after the war to underground parking? Is that the idea?
No, like right now we're using underground parking as shelters. So
So you're doing it the other way, right? And so you're displacing the underground parking using it as shelters. So that could mean that there's less underground parking, and so that could be one of the reasons why you're seeing more cars on the side of the road. Denise?
Yeah, I want to say that underground parking now in Ukraine is not what some builders want to do. We must do this because we must do this shelter like part of this use only as shelter, and the parking use as a unit, as a shelter and as a parking. It's now on the Ukrainian documents for the projects. So now it's we must do this. We have no
Mhm.
choice. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, so to mandate having anything that's where it's mandated that and it gets into the code. And again, it's very important to get those changes now because right now, not a lot of stuff is being constructed because of the war. But as soon as the war ends, you're going to have this massive amount of construction. So, if you can get the rules and the mandates in place now, then that means as soon as the war ends, as long as there's good enforcement of those codes, you will be able to provide more effective space. And then Solomia says, what about blackout because of Russia? Electric cars is good idea, but Ukrainian reality. But today, uh, a lot of people choose electric cars. You're saying that, so Solomia, are you referring to the idea that if the electric grid is not very stable, then you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket, to say, having everybody driving an electric car because then there'd be more vulnerable?
Actually, in my, as I see today, lots of people, my friends, choose electric car, but it's like a second car in their family because it's more cheaper, uh, comfortable, and of course more ecological. But it's a second car. And Ukrainian reality, as you know, we have a lot of risk, not only about infrastructure for electric cars, but also about blackouts. Yeah, but in general, I see that people choose this way. But also, I also want to make some comments about Lviv and the parking situation. We have a very nice old city, yeah, more than 750 years. But we also have narrow and cozy streets, which was for horses, not for cars, lots of cars. And it's right now, it's a horrible situation in the city. I lost over 40 minutes looking for parking in the center. It's more than I take time to get to the center. It's crazy. And also it's funny situation when I find some places and I also check it. Actually, parking fines, it's cheaper than the cost for parking when for parking for whole day when I park my car for permanent parking place. It will be for me. It will be more cheaper to pay parking fines than pay for this parking. And also, for example, for the last days, I saw that place where it was for free. Right now, it's a lot of lines that said that you should pay. You know, they pay in this line, but they not create infrastructure, places, comfortable places for people and for cars. Actually, it's not okay when they want only to earn money and don't create a condition for normal safety, good parking places in the city. It's also we have idea that like in many European cities to create around the city like this parking. I love these words when you it's big parking places, and after that you sit on the public transport and go to the center and so on. How it calls? I forgot.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to earlier, a park and ride.
Yeah,
Park
yeah,
and
yeah,
ride,
yeah, yeah. It's
typically
in
what you
Vienna
refer
and the
to.
different
Mhm.
city. I saw it very comfortable to
Yeah.
leave the car there and use public transport. But also question about public transport and quality and about, for example, most of Ukrainian public transport without conditioner, and it's horrible in the summer. It's crazy how it possible, and so on. So. it's very necessary to find a good decision for every city, how to care about nature, ecological, and how to care comfortable your time. Because when I use public transport, I waste a lot of time. Then I use my car, yeah. And so I already pay and look in this parking place, but for me it's more easily. In some case not. I try to, for example, sometimes I go to one point, park in my car and use tram. It's more romantic and beautiful when I have a time.
Yeah, certainly. So again, it's all about the competition between the different modes. What amenities does one have? What amenities do the other? And how can you use pricing to incentivize one over the other? So what you say about it's cheaper to pay the parking ticket than it is to not. So that's been a big problem with freight deliveries, for example, like in New York City. The delivery drivers were told just park illegally. You'll get a ticket, but it's far cheaper to pay the ticket than it is to park where you're supposed to park and walk because of the time savings that you'll have. And so all of those times when you have what you would say perverse incentives that encourage people to do things that they shouldn't do, that's a problem. So let me talk about some of the solutions here, because that's kind of what Shup's talking about. He identifies the problem, he proposes some solutions. So these are the impacts of parking requirements. So parking requirements, they subsidize the cars, they increase overall traffic congestion, lead to increasing housing costs because you're incorporating that cost into it, preventing walkability, and they also set up a dual city where the city is fine for the population that has a car, but the population that doesn't have a car basically has uh, is second class or second class citizens. And he also cites this statistic uh, that cars are parked 95% of their lives and driven only 5%. So that's very, very, inefficient use of capital. Because, like, if you go to an airport, let's say, and you see planes are arriving, and the plane, and then they unload the passengers, and then they load the other passengers on, and the planes are basically flying 24 hours a day. They're always being used 24 hours a day. But a privately owned car, is used 5% of the time, and it's idle 95% of the time. So, Lamia, go ahead.
Thank you. I just also about cars and another topic of urbanism. I also think about, it's also two sides, because when all use like in American use cars, there is no people on the street. And it also, when we have read some books which you recommended in our program, we see that it's a concept that people on the street, they like save like a system of securities that can and so on, that people should be on the street, it's more livable and so on. But I saw in the United States and lots of cities of Europe, I also see very beautiful street, very beautiful everything, but there's no people. And sometimes I joke with my son, who create everything? Where is the people? Maybe aliens. Where is the people? Pictures very wonderful, very cool, but where is the people? Where is the life? It's also, how to try to find this balance when it's very comfortable, beautiful, but sometimes we lost this natural connection, community, I don't know, this real life and real, I don't know, humanity, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's of course a big problem, and they'll sometimes see on architectural renderings when they see the idealized form. Sometimes they don't even put people into those pictures because the street it's like a museum, right? The street looks like a museum, but there's nobody using it. So changing people's attitudes about that. And then I have a comment here in the chat about Jitomer, and it says it used to be a concept of a 15-minute city. Before the since the beginning of the war, due to safety concerns and decline of public transport, the number of private cars has increased, and now there are traffic jams. The city has effectively become a 30-minute city. The issue of transport has been brought up for discussion at the Civic Assembly. Yeah, and I might mention, Olga, I think that my colleague Alexandra Koidel will be doing a urban mobility meeting in Zhytomyr, I think in a couple of weeks. So you might check that out. I think it's called in the Bridge UA program. So that could be something if you're interested in that topic and you're in Zhytomyr, that could be something that you might like to learn about. Um, and so let's talk a little bit about the recommendations.
Yes,
What are
I was, Nathan, it's me. I was at the first assembly,
uh-huh.
and
So
then I
you
continue to work with this
okay,
problem.
great. So you're familiar with that program, Bridgeway? Yeah. Okay, great. So what are Shoup's recommendations? One, remove off-site parking requirements. Two would be to price on-street parking dynamically so that demand equals supply. Because basically, if you just have a linear price saying it's $1 an hour to park no matter when, let's say, then you're going to have a lot of times like what Solomia is talking about. She's driving around and around and around in a circle looking for a parking spot for 30 minutes because the price of parking is always the same. So in the same way that you use in a toll road where they will raise the marginal cost of the toll higher based upon how many people are need to use it on in a given hour. You should do the same thing with on-street parking. You should have a dynamic system that measures how much capacity there is and raise the value so that you don't have a situation where people are driving around aimlessly trying to find parking because that will generate a lot more revenue, and then you can use that revenue to subsidize the transit system. So you can basically again uh, allow the population to pay the true cost of the parking, not just a flat fee. And so the other point that Shoup notes is that, like I mentioned earlier, parking he views as understudied because it's boring. Um, and so that's why he was one of the first academics to really focus on this. Um, he also talks about the psychological impact. He said in America, we have this reflexive fear of not having enough parking, not being able to find a parking space. So we over provide to make sure that we'll always have a parking space. So even if the parking space is only going to be full, again, 5 or 10% of the time, there's enough parking provided in the system to make sure that in 100% of the time, you'll always be able to find a parking spot. And that's of course an extremely wasteful use of land. Um, and then the other problem is that not only we provide a lot of parking spots, but every parking spot has to accommodate every type of car, which means that every parking spot has to accommodate the largest car. And so if you say, that in the United States, and probably in Ukraine now too, there are a lot of people driving very large SUVs, and that means that every parking spot then has to go wider and longer. And so that's another huge problem because not every car needs all that space. But if you're saying that everybody has to have that standardized space because that's the space of the largest car, then that means that you can have a tremendous growth in the overall space needed, not only for the physical parking of the vehicle, but also for the turning radius of the vehicle. Because if you have a longer car, like a long truck or something like that, it takes longer to turn, so you need more space between rows of parking for that reason. So you should have a situation like they have in Europe where you're incentivized and you're charged less not only for a parking spot, but you're charged less. You're charged based upon the physical displacement that you have on the street. So you're charged per linear meter as opposed to just one price for every single car. And then where this really becomes even more obvious is when you look at overhead images, particularly in the United States, of how much of the land is used for parking. Both how much is used for actual parking and how much is used for just in case we might need to park someday. So when you have this idea of you have two buildings and you have this huge football field's worth of land for all the parking that needs to be provided, it becomes clear A, how much opportunity cost there is by this over provision, and B, how impossible it would be to make this into some sort of walkable urban form because all the buildings are so spread out from each other, again, to accommodate the cars. And so here, surface parking and the lack of underground parking really harms the overall urban form. So opportunity costs, we argue, are not recognized. What would happen if the city removes the off-street parking requirements and changes to demand-based pricing? Um, so in that case, property owners might decide their land is more valuable for housing than for parking. I had a hand raised. Who was
Yeah, it was me. I had a
it?
question
Eva?
for last slide
Uh-huh.
about housing price. It's really interesting because just like a few days ago, I've had a conversation with a friend that lives in Barcelona, and we were talking about like comparing like French and Spanish, like Barcelona and Marseille and Kiev too. I talked a lot about Ukraine, and we talked about new urban design and new urban tools. That in Barcelona now we have this well, not trend, but movement to like make streets more alive for people, not for cars. I mean, like in all Europe, I guess.
Hmm.
And he told me about a very interesting case that there was one like neighborhood, one street that was really like car centered. So, for example, the street, it was like maybe highway, large highway, a lot of parking. And so they changed it and it became like a street where people would go outside. There would be much less space for cars and for parking. So
Hmm.
basically, like inhabitants started going out on the streets, having lunch on the streets, and also like commercial companies or like retail came back to the street. So like the street really became comfortable for inhabitants, but actually it was a tool. I mean, not a tool, but it's led to the gentrification of the neighborhood because the population that was kind of, I guess, lower middle class that was there, they actually left because the housing prices went up after the
Hmm.
streets became kind of trendy and hipster or whatever.
Hmm.
Because I mean, a lot of retail came in, and I mean. There's a joke that if you see in your neighborhood here like a specialty coffee shop, it means your prices are gonna get higher, like in a couple of months. So it became an interesting case how actually the urbanism that is meant like to provide the comfortable way of living, it also became kind of a tool of gentrification of like original population. And I don't know, I just
Hmm.
wanted to like know your thoughts about this.
Well, that is the major concern. And so, because again, you see the artist renderings of like the ideal street, and you see people sitting outside drinking coffee in the middle of the day as opposed to like working in an office. and you kind of you see this sort of gentrified life or sort of wealthy presentation of wealth. And in a sense, what people that would argue against this are saying is like what you're arguing for is this sort of life that's unrealistic for most working class people. So you shouldn't necessarily be designing a street on the assumption that everyone's just going to be sitting around drinking coffee all day, something like that. That's not necessarily the urban planning goal as well. Some streets probably should be more functional. Some streets probably should be more pedestrian. You need everything. You need some streets that are capable of accommodating these large trucks, like we saw earlier. Because otherwise, I mean, if we're going back a few slides here, let me show you. Um, like if you have to deliver every single parcel to every store with a little vehicle like this, that's extremely expensive to do compared to having most of it delivered in a truck like this. And so there's a trade-off between having streets that are very functional versus having streets that are very pretty to look at. And sometimes that it's difficult to do both at the same time. But I think where you should have the exception is that the cities have to be safe in any case. So if you do have the streets that are very basically designed not just for cars but also for utility trucks, they still have to be safe. And so that would be kind of the transition to the next topic, which is more on safety. So
Thank you.
thank you, thank you. Have you, by the way, have you been to Barcelona?
Yeah, I have been to Barcelona. Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that Barcelona does do a pretty good job in being a city that it's relatively easy to drive around, but it's also relatively easy to get places with transit. So it's not the case always that you have to choose. You have to have everybody driving, or you have to have everybody in transit. You can have a city that makes the best of both, has about the best of both worlds. And so I think again, for particularly cities like medium-sized cities, like what someone was mentioning earlier, Cherkasy or other places like that, you're never going to have probably a situation where all the trips are taken by transit. So you have to basically make your peace with the automobile, but do the best that you can to avoid the, the idea that if someone doesn't have a car, that they can't really experience the city for everything that it is. Okay.
Nathan,
And so,
can I
Lilith?
interrupt with one remark on let's say
Yeah, sure.
logistics? I don't know how much topics you have more, but we usually have the lecture part about an hour.
Yeah.
Although I really like your approach and the interactiveness, and it's also a very
Yeah.
interesting topic. So I'm
Well, could we do
trying to
this
weigh in.
since a lot of people are talking like at during the lecture, which is good? Could we
Yes, nice.
potentially do the lecture a little bit longer and shorten the
Yeah, it's
discussion?
fine to me. It's also a little bit a question to Elena because she did not count on it, maybe.
Oh, okay.
How are
Yeah,
you
that's
doing?
the question for Elena. Tell you what, could we do? I'll try to go through the 15 minutes. Is that good?
Yeah, totally fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
So let's talk about two additional topics, and I'll maybe if we don't get to everything, I'll just leave them for you to read on your own maybe later. Let's talk a bit about
Not to interrupt you because it's great, but it's just
but yeah, Elena has a lot of translating to do. And so transportation safety, um, let's talk about that, and then we'll probably leave the final section on disability access for just reading. Topics. So we think about for transportation safety. What are the causes of accidents? What are the risks? What are the technology solutions? And what are the education policy and educational solutions? So this is becoming, of course, a huge issue Ukraine because, of course, every life is extremely valuable, particularly these days when so many people have died needlessly. And so there should be an extreme focus on preventing accidents wherever possible. Because if we look at the number of people that die every year in traffic fatalities, over 1 million people die every single year. And if we look around the world, 90% of all road fatalities are in low and middle income countries. So there's a tremendous burden paid by low and middle income countries, of which Ukraine would count as a middle income country, um, every year. In the United States, 37,000 people die in road crashes every year, and an additional 2.35 million are injured or disabled. One way of measuring the road fatalities is as related to the total population. So if you have different countries and looking at the road fatalities per 100,000 population, you see that you have tremendous distinction: 45 per 100,000 in Venezuela, where you have basically a very poorly governed country and gasoline that is basically free. That's a very bad combination. Vietnam, where you have everybody riding around in motor scooters. United States, where you have pretty good road design and pretty safe cars, but just a whole lot of people driving long distances. Uh, but then you have places that are like Italy, where you would think would have very high rates of fatalities because you see crazy Italian drivers driving around like, really fast in Ferraris and stuff like that. But they're also driving cars that are quite small, and so when they bump into each other, it usually doesn't result in a fatality. There's a lot of accidents, but there are relatively few fatalities. Um, so we have to think about what's really important. So one piece of good news, if we look at the mortality per 100,000 population, um, so if we look at Ukraine versus Poland, um, you see a dramatic fall off in mortality in Ukraine starting in about 2008. So starting in, kind of the one of the revolutions, I guess you could say. It was not only a political revolution, it was kind of a traffic safety revolution as well. And you've seen a lot of driver education. You've seen a lot of different initiatives. I remember asking my students, Vitalina, I don't know if you were on that lecture when we talked about this topic in class. And I remember some people talking about all the public information campaigns that started in 2008 that made it seem like it's not cool to drive like a maniac. And it's not cool to drive in the oncoming lane and do all these types of things. And they credited that with with lowering the rate of fatalities, because obviously during this time you still have more people buying cars. So if you would say that more cars mean more accidents, it should be going up, but instead it's going down, which means it's better governance. Um, okay, let me go on to the next. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, as car ownership rates increase, so does the probability of accidents. If you look at how many cars are registered per 1,000 people, in the United States, there's basically one car per person, 867 cars per 1,000 people, even including children. In Ukraine, it's 320, right? So it's about a little more than a third of the auto ownership rate, and still less than half of the auto ownership rate of Poland, which is a country of relatively similar economy. And so, if you think that in 10 or 15 years Ukraine will have a much better economy, a much higher per capita income, this number will go up. It might not go up this high, but it will probably go up to probably 500 per capita. So you have a lot more cars in the system. You have to think about that in terms of accidents. And where are people most likely to die? if we look at US data, there's a tremendous difference in deaths per, again, this would be deaths per 100 million passenger miles. So this is again um, not looking at the amount of cars in the system per population, but how much those cars are driven. Because in Netherlands, a lot of people have a car, but the average distance that they're driving is very short. In United States, it's very, very long because people are driving, 100 kilometers sometimes a day. And so, if you look at where are people most likely to die, there's no question that they're much more likely to die in in when they're on the road with their own vehicle as opposed to in a bus. And if they're in a plane, basically nothing. Um, and so this is a way of showing how difficult it's been in the United States to bring down the overall fatality rate. Because even though we've instituted airbags and we've instituted all these technologies um, to make it safer, we still have about 35,000 people dying every single year from traffic fatalities, and that ratio is about the same. And in some ways, it's even come up a little bit. And part of the reason for that is that you have more people driving heavier, larger cars. And so even if they have more safety features, they're larger. Um, so if we look at the breakdown of highway deaths, um, you have to realize it's not just the people in the cars; it's also who they hit. So if they hit a motorcyclist or they hit a pedestrian, that's 6,000 pedestrians killed in the United States per year by cars. If you think about a bicyclist, 850 bicyclists, whereas only about 49 people died while riding a transit vehicle, and about 200 people were killed by being struck by a transit vehicle. But before you say, well, that means transit is perfectly safe compared to driving, you have to realize people have to get to the transit vehicle somehow. So if it's not safe for them to walk there, then it's not safe for them to use the transit vehicle. So these are just some statistics to look at. You can look at them later about in Ukraine, what are the causes of fatalities, how much of it is caused by speeding, by violation of pedestrian crossing rules, um, and all these different factors, and what are the deficits in data? What data are we missing in Ukraine right now? We don't really have a good breakdown of accidents by mode. So how many are dying in cars versus transit versus bicycles? And we don't have a lot of data on minor collisions because often those are not reported. So if people just pay each other privately for damage and they don't involve the police, well, sometimes there's no data on whether that collision occurred. So that's also a problem in tracking safety statistics in Ukraine. And the other thing that they don't have a good breakdown on is by billion of vehicle kilometer traveled. So they don't know the relative safety per kilometer you drive, what your probability of an accident is. I'll skip over the US. I'll just mention that US more large cars means more severe accidents, and that's one a danger to pedestrians, and it's also a danger because of stopping distance. So large vehicles take a lot longer to stop, and that means that it takes longer than people think they will do to stop, and that means that you're going to have a lot more highway accidents. And then also larger vehicles like SUVs have a higher center of gravity, which means they tend to roll over more. Um, and so when the car flips and rolls, you have a very, very high probability of death. So only 2.1% of accidents result in a rollover, but in the United States, that 2% constitutes 35% of overall fatalities. So anything that you can do to prevent rollover accidents, which would include disincentivizing cars with a very high center of gravity, would have a significant safety impact. And so, last slide I'll do for this lecture, for Elena's sake and for all of you, is to introduce this concept of Vision Zero. So, Vision Zero is a new way of looking at transportation safety. Rather than seeing transportation deaths as inevitable, you see all traffic deaths as preventable. Rather than relying on perfect human behavior, so rather than the engineer saying, if everybody drives exactly the way that they're supposed to, you integrate human failing in the approach. So you give up the idea that people are going to put their cell phones down. You give up the idea that people are not going to be distracted, that they're always going to be driving perfectly. You accommodate for the fact that people are basically going to be people. They're going to continue to behave badly. You still have to design a system that works for that system. The traditional safety approach, you prevent cars from impacting each other, from colliding with each other. The Vision Zero approach says there's always going to be accidents, there's always going to be cars bumping into other cars. The most important thing is to prevent death and severe injuries. So in Italy, again, lots of accidents. You want to buy insurance for your car. If you have a rental car in Italy, it's extremely high because everybody's bumping into each other all the time, but they're not dying, and that's the most important thing. And then the last point is that saving lives, that we're getting away from the idea that saving lives is expensive to saving lives is actually very affordable and actually gives you a lot more benefit than cost. And there's a lot more I could cover, but I know we're out of time. So I'll go ahead and break there. Any last questions before we break and go into our groups?
Now I'm almost doing the opposite, but can you say a few things on this slide? What would be the practical, like, urbanistic measurements that could be taken to have this Vision Zero? Because it stays a bit abstract.
So it's about the way that you train both engineers, because usually safety starts in the level of road design engineering. So you're training people to how you would optimize the road network, and then you're also training drivers in a different way. Um, and you're also training planners about what sort of features they should be incorporating into it. So you're kind of, and this is that point that I didn't mention. You don't rely on the individual; you rely on the system. So you don't assign the blame to the individual, because often the reason why there are accidents, it's a problem with the entire system that's been set up. It's not just because one person made a mistake. So let me.
Thank you. I think, like, for example, in Ukraine, yeah, I think it's necessary make a huge work in prevent action. I mean, we should from kindergarten, from school, make some educational course. I don't know. Behaving people can understand from childhood how to behave on the street, how it correct, what is this what наслідки
consequences.
Not enough Yes, we have not enough good culture from childhood. How to? Everybody knows, yeah. In one case, everybody knows, but they, in reality, they very often do not correct thing on the road, and it's also. For one side, it's pedestrian and how they behave. We should learn them how to behave. Pedestrians won't go cross the streets. Very often they just run like horse because they are afraid of somebody push them. And not all, actually, it's not bad, so bad situation. I see that it's getting better actually in Ukraine, but drivers also don't feel enough, I don't know, responsibilities that they can push somebody on the on the road. I mean, maybe it should be more fine or something like that. That drivers afraid of. For example, I saw how it in Austria, yeah, when pedestrians just only think about to go through this across the street, drivers already stop. And they go very slowly and relaxed, take it, kind of stress, you know. In Ukrainian, we have totally different situation. But that's when said, oh, when it's my moment to cross the street, and I also before I received my driver license. I'm not good in sometimes I cross the street in not right way, but when after I got my driver license, I said, oh my God, it's totally different world on this street. So totally it should be two different approach for pedestrians and learning, create this got a word, and another one for drivers. It should be some measures that they think about that, okay, it's pedestrian in the first place and we should care about them all.
So basically what you're saying is a long-term cultural change, and I think it's a systems approach, and there are things, but the change can occur relatively quickly because, like we saw in Ukraine, you had a very rapid decrease in fatalities over a relatively short period of time. So I know we should thank you so much. I think we should stop it there, Lilette.
And so also, just a minute, I forgot that it also pedestrian also wears black black clothes, and in the dark time of day they just cross the line. A lot of accidents happens because of them. We have a blind zone, as you know, and we can't see. So.
Yeah, teenagers wearing black, looking at their phone with their phones on. Bad idea all around. Definitely. Okay, Villa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathan. It was a real pleasure, and well, you saw the interaction and you saw all the reactions and experience, and there will be 1,000 more questions to you. Please, everybody, use this general board to pop up questions that come up during the week and just put them there. Nathan is there the whole period of 3 more weeks. So, and is definitely will keep an eye on our boards. So please just fire. And also ask questions to each other, because we see there's so much experience here in the different cities. I'm really inspired also when I see examples from other cities popping up, and people who know their stuff. So thanks a lot. It's